Okay, now we're going to move on to talking about the big blind facing raise, the much more standard situation that you're going to face in 99% of your matches. Limps, of course, are going to be rare, but I just want to take care of that first before diving in here. Now, I want to say this because what you're going to have to do in the big blind is going to change a lot from opponent to opponent, from bet size to bet size, etc. And I can't just break down, okay, if you play these 200 opponents, here's what you're going to do for each of them. So what we're going to do, we're going to break down the three main ranges I want you to play out of, what you should do versus min raise, what you should do versus 2.5x, and what you should do versus a 3x. And then we're going to fill in the gap a little bit on talking about what hands are going to become playable as it moves, and some other factors to think about when looking at post-flop. Okay, now, I think that I was one of the first people in Heads Up No Limit that really pioneered playing super loose in the big blind. I mean, there was a couple other guys that definitely played more than their fair share of hands in the big blind as well. But when I first started playing, I remember that the standards for what players would defend the big blind was very tight. I mean, versus min raises, it was commonly thought that you're supposed to defend about 50% in the big blind, which of course is completely wrong. Now, I realized just by doing some simple equity calculations that you need to have 25% equity in the big blind to call an open, and you're just simply going to get that when you're facing a standard open range with many weak holdings. The problem, of course, is you will suffer some degree of under-realizing because you are out of position, but at the same time, it's such a large equity differential from what you need to what you're getting. So I've been an advocate of playing a very loose big blind defend range for a long time. You're going to kind of see that within these ranges. Now, there is something interesting that kind of happens. Now, if you face a min raise or you face a 2.1x, I'm really getting down to the nitty gritty here, but if you face a min raise or you face a 2.1x, you shouldn't really be looking to change your defense strategy that much because most hands are kind of, if they can defend for 2, they can defend for 2.1. But as you get into 2.2, 2.3, 2.4, each of those gaps, I believe more hands kind of fall off and are no longer defensible. Now, as far as like pure total defense frequency goes, I generally advocate about 95% defense against a min raise, about an 80% defense against 2.5x, and about a 60% defense against a 3x. Those things can change. If your opponent folds out to 3-bet, that's the first way you're going to be able to play wider by 3-betting more bluffs. If your opponent plays very poor post-flop, you can call more hands pre. If your opponent starts c-betting a lot less, you can call more hands pre. There's a lot of factors to take into consideration when you might want to change a little bit here and there. But the main thing is this: you start with the range, and then you make minor tweaks and adjustments based on those factors. You don't just like, okay, this guy plays bad post-flop, let's just see some flops, right, with whatever. You want to make very small adjustments with your range based on the way that your opponent is playing. You start with the big picture, and then you go to the smaller picture. Now, if you're playing someone and they're opening 2.25x, and you have these ranges, right, 2 and 2.5, well, you're gonna know that you're gonna play somewhere in the middle. You play 95 against the min raise, you play 80 against 2.5. So it's safe to say you're gonna play around 87% or so, and those hands will kind of show them. It'll be easy to see which hands fall into that range because you're just gonna look at what hands are better within those hands that would normally fold. So I would absolutely. I think it's actually kind of mandatory if you're going to play heads up. I would memorize these ranges all pretty much down to the wire, or pretty much down to each individual hand, and I would know the difference between them. And then that way, when you're playing someone and they're 2.25ing or 2.7xing or whatever, then you're going to be able to take a very technical approach in how to respond to them. Because you know what, guys, this sounds like a really simple leak that high stakes players wouldn't have, but there are a lot of players out there, and I'm not going to say names, but I'm sure some of them know who they are. And they treat 2.6 and 2.8 like they're the same thing, or 2.9 and 2.7 like they're the same thing, or 2.3 and 2.15 like they're the same thing. And they're not. Really, if you're going to play heads up at the highest level, you have to be making adjustments across the board. Like, you should be decreasing your defense slightly as the size increases throughout all of these sizes, or else you're not playing good poker. And it's a kind of a crude adjustment that I made and some of my students made along the way, where we picked sizes that we realized that people wouldn't, either would defend too much, defend too little. For a while, there was a bunch of guys that when they realized that they could play loose in the big blind, they treated a 3x similar to a 2.5x. So 3xing a somewhat tight range ended up being a pretty good strat. But the key is going to be to sit down, memorize these ranges. I'm going to give you all 3 of them, and then know them in and out and understand what changes them. Now, I want to talk about part of the 3-betting strategy I've used in the big blind that's probably the most controversial. It's probably the thing that I do the most differently from a lot of players, and that's my 3-bet bluffing approach in the big blind. And I've done this less in the last few years, but overall, I've been way more bluff heavy than a lot of people recommend. And the reason is actually because the equity required for you to 3-bet against some opponents can end up being quite low. Now, this was a lot better back in the day. I'm not sure, for some of you people that have been playing heads-up no limit for a long time, you might remember that back in the day, players were opening 100% min-raising the button because people played so tight in the big blind. And by the way, that was the nuts. I did that for years in my career. It was a very strong strategy, and people were playing way too tight. So that was a great strat. But the counter to that strat, and this is actually what I was doing for all of those years, the counter to that strat was 3-bet a ton of bluffs very aggressively. Because when someone's opening 100%, they're really not equipped to deal with a 3-bet strategy. Generally speaking, as 3-bets, fold to 3-bet gets above 50, 55%, you can start to 3-bet extremely wide for value. I'll show you some of the math in the next video, but you can start to 3-bet extremely wide for value. And so these people that were opening that wide were often victims to these very aggressive 3-betting strategies. Now, the thing is, when I realized this was happening, there was a lot of people folding 60 or 70% of their hands. I didn't want to have hands like Ace Jack or King Queen, okay? Even though they're strong enough and I 3-bet them today. Why 3-bet those hands when your opponent's mainly going to fold and you're going to face a lot of 4-bets when they do continue? Doesn't really make sense to have those hands. So there were certainly times, 2010, 2011, 2012, where I was 3-betting like 25, 30%, and it was like 70% bluffs. And those were the days that you cannot get away with that anymore unless you're playing someone that is raising every button and playing somewhat conservatively versus 3-bet. But what that kind of spawned for me is this idea of polarization in the same way that, we raise polarized against limps, and we raise bluffier against people that are limping weak. If they're going to fold, I want to make them fold with one of my worst hands. Because then it goes back to how many hands can we play? How many hands can we play profitably? And by playing the most hands, you make the most money. So why take hands that can profitably call and 3-bet bluff them? I'd rather take a hand that can't quite, or a hand that's close between the two. So most of my ranges, in fact, almost all my ranges pre-flop, have more polarization than I think what a lot of people might recommend. A lot of the higher stakes people have been playing. When I look at the last 3-4 years of high stakes no limit, there's not really been that polarization. I feel like it might be in part because fold to 3-bet has gone down by so much. So then obviously being polar and bluffy is great when they fold, but when they don't, it gets a lot worse. So anyway, I wanted to make you aware of the fact that my ranges tend to have a lot more bluffs than the traditional ones, and also be aware that there's people that you need to remove those. These are kind of optional-ish bluffs, but I would use them kind of as my standard, and then as I learn about my opponent, maybe take them out. But you can add bluffs, you can remove bluffs. It's going to kind of come down to you, and it's going to kind of come down to your opponent that you're playing and how they play post-flop. It's going to come down to a lot of factors. But the point is, be aware that true polarization with taking some actual bottom hands that can't quite call and bluffing with them can be a very effective strategy, particularly against players with high fold to re-raise frequency, re-raise percentages or whatever. So the second thing I want to say before we move on here to the next video, in these ranges that I'm going to show you, there's a lot of hands that can go either way. Like you can 3-bet them half the time, you could 3-bet them a fourth of the time, you could 3-bet them 3/4 of the time. So I'm going to note that. I'm going to note which hands I think are kind of in the vicinity where you could 3-bet them a small amount or a lot. And I'm going to kind of leave that up to you how complex you want to get with it. I will say I think that going for a more efficient strategy where you really know your ranges is better than just kind of screwing up a strategy where you have like very complex ranges. But the biggest thing is to be about in the ballpark of the ranges I'm going to give you. And when you're in a hand, know what hands you're 3-betting so you can create your strategy. Because if you don't know what your range is going to look like post-flop, it's going to get so much harder. So this is the time to really take these ranges, study them. We're about to walk through them, and get ready so that you know post-flop what you're working with.